have been a fan of baseball for at least 30 years. I must have attended more than 1,000 games across the country, and I've said before how the acts and antics I developed and performed in the stands helped lead to the creation of my own online reviewer persona. Baseball has absolutely been a huge part of my life. And yet the one constant through all the years for me is hearing that the game is dying. That Major League Baseball and the game itself have long fallen behind the likes of the NFL, NBA, and their college equivalents in football and basketball, that the game is just an afterthought today. The 1994 players' strike that led to the World Series being canceled for only the second time in history was supposed to have been the death knell for the sport. So was the revelation in the mid to late 2000s that many players since at least the mid to late 1990s were using steroids that likely led to the massive home run records that were largely responsible for bringing those fans back to the ballparks. Lately, I've been hearing cries from a number of former players saying the game today is in worse shape than it's ever been, claiming that an over-reliance on analytics and computer numbers taking the game out of the hands of the players and coaches and solely being run by, to paraphrase them, nerds in the front office, has led to the game being boring and unwatchable and thus causing fans to turn away again. But what if I was to tell you there was a time period when the game of baseball was in far worse shape than any point of the past 40 years, and that, believe it or not, it was actually the period most baseball historians claim was the best time for the game? I'm Rowdy C, I'm an ugly American, and this is the story of how baseball's golden age was actually not so golden. If you ask most people who have watched baseball for a very long time what the greatest period of the game was, they will likely tell you it was the 1950s. They'll tell you the legendary stories of Willie, Mickey, and the Duke, and the vicious battles the three major league clubs in New York City fought for baseball supremacy. They'll talk of Bobby Thompson's shot heard round the world that won the 1951 pennant for the New York Giants over the hated Brooklyn Dodgers. Willie Mays' catch in 1954 that drove the Giants to win the World Series. Or when the Dodgers finally came out on top in 1955 over the New York Yankees after a lifetime of wait till next year. But the truth is that as far as golden as baseball was in New York back then, it was becoming a vast wasteland for the 13 other clubs in the American and National Leagues. And even in New York itself, that game was not as successful as many today might claim it was. Throughout that decade, attendance around all of baseball was dropping, and dropping badly. Keep in mind that nowadays, drawing a total of 2 million in attendance for a whole season is considered the minimum for having a good season at the box office. Well, back then, the mighty New York Yankees, after drawing 2 million attendance each year from 1946 until 1950, would not reach that number again until the year the newly renovated Yankee Stadium reopened in 1976. Their crosstown rivals in the National League, the Brooklyn Dodgers, despite being known for having one of the most passionate fan bases in the history of the game, never drew 1.3 million in attendance for any season they played in Brooklyn. The New York Giants never drew more than 1.6 million, and only drew 1 million fans once in their last 6 seasons in New York. Given that major league teams played 77 home games a season in those days, 1 million attendance for a season would average to just under 13,000 per game. That would be considered poor by today's standards. And yet that was what the two best teams in the National League, playing in the most populous city in the country, were drawing on average. Now, obviously, when the baseball fandom is split between 3 different teams in one city, no one club is going to draw an extremely high number to the ballpark. But that doesn't excuse how much less the turnstiles were going in all the other baseball cities. Overall, baseball had seen a record attendance of 21 million in 1948, only to see that number have dropped by 20% just 10 years later. In 1958, 5 of the 8 American League clubs failed to draw 1 million in attendance, with 4 of those 5 clubs drawing less than 830,000. That's less than 11,000 people per game. The National League was doing a little bit better, but even still, every single Major League franchise, except for the Yankees and Dodgers, had at least one season in the 1950s where they failed to draw 1 million in attendance. And a few of them had seasons where they didn't even draw 500,000, which would have been less than 6,500 people per game. And this was after 5 Major League clubs left cities that they had to share with another team for one they would have all to themselves. More on that in a bit. Now, obviously, there are some factors that contributed to these numbers. Some might not necessarily be anyone's fault, but most, if not all, were indicators that changes needed to be made in the game. One of the biggest factors had to be that nighttime baseball was only recently becoming in vogue. Many teams still played most games in the daytime, which obviously is going to provide less available days for many people to go to the ballpark. Also, as I said before, there was the issue of multiple clubs in the same cities. As the 1950s began, a number of cities in America still had at least one American League and one National League team in them, not just in New York. Clearly, having multiple Major League clubs in one city is going to split the fans. And by the 50s, it was clear that this was not optimal for most of these cities. And it drove a number of clubs to relocate to cities that had no major baseball at all. By 1955, the Boston Braves had moved to Milwaukee, the Philadelphia Athletics left for Kansas City, and the St. Louis Browns headed for Baltimore, where they became the Orioles. Of course, the most infamous relocations came after the 1957 season, when the New York Giants and Brooklyn Dodgers both headed west for San Francisco and Los Angeles, respectively. And while many people from that period still blame greed on the club owners' parts for those moves in particular, there may have been other factors that drove those decisions. The 1950s was when suburban migration and sprawl first kicked into high gear in the USA. Many people were being encouraged to move out of the cities themselves for the suburban towns on the outskirts, where streetcars and trolleys were replaced with everyone being expected to own and drive their own personal cars everywhere. One of the big instigators of this change was New York City's Park Commissioner Robert Moses, who instituted a lot of development changes intent on literally driving people out of the inner city boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn and into the suburban neighborhoods of Long Island. This was a big problem for most baseball teams, as the inner city ballparks they played in had all been built at a time when few people drove cars, and thus there was very little parking to be found. As such, many clubs were also using even just the threat of relocation to get their cities to provide them with something as simple as more parking spaces, or perhaps a new stadium altogether. Dodgers owner Walter O'Malley had long wanted a new stadium for his team, but he did want to keep them in Brooklyn. And as hard as this may be to believe, he wanted to build and pay for it himself. All he needed from the city was the land to build it on. Robert Moses refused to grant O'Malley the land in Brooklyn because he was insistent on building a huge brand new state-of-the-art stadium in Queens. The actual deal breaker that sent the Dodgers west was Moses insisting the city own the stadium and lease it to the Dodgers, while O'Malley wanted to own the stadium himself. Quite a far cry from today, when team owners demand that their cities own the stadium and pay for most of the building costs themselves. The relocations were, like them or not by the historians, a boon for baseball, as every club that moved saw a rise in attendance in their new homes. Still, it was not much of an improvement overall, as baseball, and especially the American League, had one huge elephant towering over them that was drawing away interest in the game. And that would be the dominance of the New York Yankees. Nowadays, people bemoan the supposed unfair advantage the Yankees have over the rest of baseball with their money, fan base, and other resources, but the current situation is nothing compared to the past. For all their riches, the Yankees have still just won 7 pennants since 1982 and just twice since 2002. That's relatively still impressive, but consider that the Yankees won the American League Championship 29 times from 1921 to 1964. 29 pennants in 44 years. From 1947 to 64, they took the pennant 15 times in 18 years. Generally, if you were a fan of any American League team other than the Yankees back then, you went into each season looking at second place at best. Yankees owners Del Webb and Dan Topping had a huge amount of influence on the operation of the American League, far more than the Steinbrenners have ever had. Remember the Philadelphia Athletics move to Kansas City? When the children of Connie Mack decided they had to put the club up for sale, the deal came down to 2 groups. A consortium that promised to keep the club in Philadelphia, and Arnold Johnson, who did little to hide his desire to move the club elsewhere. It should be noted that Johnson had briefly owned Yankee Stadium itself before he sold it to the Knights of Columbus in a deal where they leased the ballpark back to him so he could lease it to the Yankees in a deal that essentially allowed the club to play there rent-free. It was very clear that Del Webb and Dan Topping wanted the Athletics to go to Johnson, and despite a number of other American League owners claiming they would never vote alongside the Yankees, ultimately, the owners voted in favor of Johnson getting the club. Johnson moved the Athletics to Kansas City, the Yankees moved their Kansas City farm club to Denver to accommodate Johnson, Del Webb's construction company got the contract to expand the Kansas City ballpark, and the Yankees and Athletics made numerous deals over the next several years that sent many star players to New York that many outsiders branded the Athletics as a Yankees farm club. And yet, the Yankees themselves, despite their largesse and success, were not a popular team in their own city. Many people that lived in the boroughs themselves had long been fans of the Giants or Dodgers. When those 2 teams left town, Webb and Topping publicly assumed many of those former fans would convert and become Yankees fans. This did not happen. But even the actual Yankees fans, most of whom came from New Jersey and Connecticut, were very tepid on those 1950s teams. Despite the fact that they won 14 pennants from 1949 to 1964, many fans thought those Yankees, led in the dugout by Casey Stengel and on the field by Mickey Mantle, were inferior to the teams of the 30s and 40s led by Joe McCarthy and Joe DiMaggio. As a result of all this, once the Dodgers and Giants left New York, leaving the Yankees without a crosstown foe to face in the World Series, which they'd had 8 times from 1947 to 1956, World Series games at Yankee Stadium could not sell out. Think about that. From all of baseball's current issues, from rising ticket prices to supposed dropping interest in the game, when was the last time you saw a World Series game that did not sell out? Even after all the negative publicity from the 1994 strike, all the games of the 1995 World Series were played to full capacity. including the games in Atlanta, where the Braves were in their third fall classic in 5 years. What's even crazier is that with how relatively unpopular the Yankees were in New York, the other 7 clubs in the American League desperately needed them for their own financial solvency. Games when the Yankees came to town absolutely drew the most people through the turnstiles, which was incredibly important when, remember, half the clubs in the American League were drawing less than 11,000 per game. In those days, every team would have had 11 home games against every opponent in their league. If we can assume that every American League team drew, on average, say, 33,000 fans for the 11 home games they played against the Yankees, that would mean that those 4 clubs that drew less than 11,000 per games for the season would have drawn only 7,000 people or less on average for all their other home games of the season. By 1959, numerous people within the American League, including the managers of the other clubs, were warning that the league would die if something was not done to especially rein in the dominance the Yankees had on the league. The Yankees owners scoffed at any attempts to make the league more competitive and thus rekindle fan interest, but by the next year, baseball was finally forced to make one change they had held back on for years. In 1960, after a threat from a consortium led by Bill Shea and Branch Rickey to form a whole new third baseball league, the Continental League, the 16 major league clubs and their owners relented to expanding baseball, adding 2 clubs to both the American and National Leagues that all started play by 1962. It should be noted that the owners had long opposed expansion, not for any claim that it would water down the talent like so many now say, but because they didn't want new owners coming in and taking away potential fans and profits that they could get from those other cities, especially with the growing potential of broadcasting their games anywhere in the country through what was being called pay TV. The clear experimental predecessor to cable TV. Still, more changes to the game would come over time. The institution of a player draft to finally try and give more teams an opportunity to compete. Instituting the designated hitter in the 1970s. Interleague play came in the 1990s. These changes clearly helped baseball keep from getting stale, even as many overseeing the game fought to keep the game in the past, and it helped spike attendance when needed. By the 1970s and 80s, the game had grown to the point where drawing well more than 1 million attendance each year was pretty much expected for any team. And by the end of the 80s, most clubs had finally reached a season drawing 2 million attendance, an achievement that previously only the post-war New York Yankees had ever reached. Today, every current Major League franchise has had multiple seasons reaching at least that 2 million mark. Even the now defunct Montreal Expos, infamously known for never being a great baseball town, managed to hit that 2 million mark twice in their history before relocating and becoming the Washington Nationals, a team that itself had 8 straight years of 2 million attendance after the previous 2 franchises to play in Washington, D.C. only had 1 season of 1 million attendance among them. Perhaps that may be the ultimate example of how much the game has grown. So yes, while baseball today may have its flaws and problems, and maybe those flaws are keeping some people away from the ballparks, it's clear the game nowadays is still in a boom period compared to its state of affairs 60 to 70 years ago. In 2022, more than 2/3 of the current 30 Major League clubs are averaging more than 20,000 attendance per game, with nearly half of all the clubs averaging more than 30,000 a game, far more than most of the 16 clubs in 1958. When you take into account the recent world issues that have affected people's desires to get out and attend events, that's actually pretty impressive. And with increasing revenue from television and now online streaming, with most clubs being valued in billions of dollars, baseball appears to be in very healthy financial shape. Who knows? Maybe the issues that former players, coaches, and writers are bemoaning will lead to fewer and fewer people attending games as the years go on. But barring an instant catastrophic drop in viewership, it would be a very long time before those numbers drop to a level that would put the game of baseball anywhere close to the peril it was in back in the supposed golden age of the 1950s. I would highly recommend checking out Michael Shapiro's Bottom of the Ninth, which was the primary source of information for this video and does a much better, more descriptive job explaining all of the turmoil and tribulation that went into baseball's supposed golden age. Stay rowdy, my friends!